Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Let's bow our heads for prayer, please. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your blessings and we thank you for your continued support to what we are trying to do each Sabbath as we study your word. We thank you for what you continue to inspire us, dear Lord, so that we can understand your word. We pray that as we read and as we study and as we continue to discuss, Lord, your word will become even clearer to us. But more than just clarity, it will move us towards making decisions to serve you in spirit and in truth, and that we will continue to use you to our name, praise, honor, and glory, so that indeed, Lord, you will guide us and direct us so that we can become members of your heavenly kingdom when you come a second time. Guide our specific activity today, dear Lord. We pray for your guidance. Speak to us, guide us. May we have understanding as we go through the various slides and content so that we can be drawn closer to you. Be with everyone who's on the platform who has joined, and we pray that you can bless them and bless their families. Is our prayer in Jesus' most holy name. Amen. All right, so welcome everyone. We continue with Revelation chapter 13. It's been a really interesting run for us. I think it's one of the sections that we really are enjoying as we go through and really excited about what we're presenting. So let's go to the screen and let's just get going as we try to pick up where we stopped off last week. All right. So we are using 2 weeks to cover the third part of Revelation chapter 13. Great. So I saw one participant send back and said they are really happy to be a part of this, and it's really important to them. And that participant, where they are, it's already evening, so we want to say to them good evening. All right. So yes, we've been looking at Revelation chapter 13. And at this stage, we are the third part of Revelation chapter 13. If you've been with us from the beginning, you begin to appreciate why we are calling it part 3. Because we spent, if you will, part 1 talking about a beast, if you will, that comes out of the sea. And its description is very much similar with some very key differences to the description of the beast that came out of the sea in Daniel chapter 7. To the extent that we were able to draw some powerful conclusions, and we said that we knew that that beast in Revelation chapter 13, in the first part, is representative of religious political Rome, which we had studied as a little horn in Daniel chapter 7, in particular 7:25, and other verses that describe the behavior and the activities of the little horn then. We then move, and that carried us, if you will, from verses 1 to 10 of Revelation chapter 13. And then we covered a few verses from chapter 11, maybe onto about 14, where we recognized that there was a beast that also succeeds this one that come out of the sea. This one is a bit different in that it comes out of the land, and it's different in other ways, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And that is our second part. We spent some time trying to identify that beast and the characteristics that makes it important for us at this point in time. And then we are now in the third phase where we are discussing something called an image to the beast and a mark to the beast and a number of the beast. And that we think is significant, and it points to some end time events. And that is really where the crust of our activities will lie today. So as we did last week, I've basically kept most of the slides from last week without a lot of changes. We'll do a quick review. We know for sure that we are really in this section of the book of Revelation, where we have already covered the historical 7 churches, the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets. And maybe sometimes it's a little bit deceiving and deceptive to say historical half, because you know for sure that the church of Laodicea is dealing with the current Christian church in this period and towards the end of time. And that when we looked at the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets, they also are talking about events leading up to when Christ will come a second time. All right, so that is just important for us to remember. We are, however, as we look at chapters 12 to 14, we are covering a very important subset of the chapter that basically provides us with a scaffolding, a means by which we can reach the future eschatological sections of the rest of the book. And it bridges, if you will, the introductory sections around seven churches, seven seals, seven trumpets, and carries us into some very critical topics around plagues, and the pollution of the church and the Christian church, which are themes that we have encountered before in Daniel. But now it gives us some very, very specific information about end time events and Armageddon, etc. That is really heady stuff. But this, what we are in right now, chapters 12 to 14, bridges that gap. And that is why for us it's such an important read at this point in time, right? So I want to just go back to what I started discussing a while ago with this slide in front of me. And let's talk about Revelation chapter 13. Now, in Revelation chapter 12, we were given 12 now. I want to be very clear, I'm saying 12. In Revelation chapter 12, we were given a very good summary, if you will, of the entire great controversy scene. We cover the fact that Lucifer became corrupted, one of the mysteries of the universe. He became sinful while in heaven. And as he became sinful while in heaven, he basically attacked the character of God and said that God is not deserving of worship and he's not deserving of his elevated position as the as the as the head of the universe and the one who deserves worship. And he basically said, as we remember our quotes from Isaiah and Ezekiel, son of the morning, how thou hast fallen, and thou hast said in thy heart, I shall be as God, and I will sit upon Mount Zion. Lucifer basically countered by suggesting that he, the bright and morning star, should deserve worship. At least at that time, we could say he would be considered a bright and morning star. He's certainly not that today, right? And that is referred to Jesus in a large extent today. So Lucifer then countered that he deserves worship, and he was able to convince us. Never forget that, because Revelation 12 told us that it describes him as a dragon with a tail, and it suggested that his tail drew 1/3 of the angels of heaven. So let us never forget that Lucifer is very persuasive in his arguments, and he was able to persuade 1/3 of heaven's angels. And so that introduced, if you will, a controversy that we know will culminate in the destruction of Lucifer, but the intervening period required God to almost prove that he is a God of love. And he chose to prove that he's a God of love by sending his son, Jesus Christ, to die upon the cross of Calvary to save mankind who had succumbed on earth. One of the created beings, in addition to the 1/3 angels, had succumbed to the attacks of the devil, Lucifer, and had sinned in the Garden of Eden through Adam and Eve. All right? So Christ came, he died upon the cross, he said it was finished, which basically meant that the argument between Christ and Satan is now over. And then we also recognize that Revelation chapter 12 told us at that point, certainly at the crucifixion of Christ and at that stage in the history of the world, Lucifer no longer had access to the heavenly courts, not in the way that he did when we saw him doing that in the book of Job when he was representing earth. He lost his ability to represent earth because God had now died for earth, and Christ was reclaiming his ownership and his authority and his role as a king of the universe, including planet Earth, which Lucifer at one point claimed that he was the one who controlled and he could walk to and fro and represent Earth, right? So in that imagery of Revelation chapter 12, we encountered Lucifer being represented as a dragon, and we are told that he wanted to first attack the woman, and we said the woman represented the church of God, not just all humanity, but God's church, and that the church brought forth a man-child, which is representative of Jesus Christ being born upon the earth, and at that time the dragon attempted to destroy him. Now, the literal dragon didn't attempt to destroy him, but it was a figurative dragon in the form of the Roman Empire. So we say that Rome at that point is represented by the dragon in the early section of Revelation chapter 12. And indeed, and in fact, history bears us out that Rome attempted to destroy baby Jesus. We know about that well. And after that, Christ came, he died, he went back up into heaven. And then what we then found is that the church itself became persecuted during the 1260 years in which the Roman Catholic Church now ruled the Western kingdom of Rome, if you will, and controlled through its leadership, the popes and the bishop of Rome, etc. And so what they then did was persecute God's people. And that also failed because as they fled into the wilderness and they went to America, etc., and we'll come back to that in a bit. We talked about that last week and we had some questions. What we then found was that having not been able to destroy the church through the Dark Ages period, we are introduced to a phase which looks like the final phase of the Great Controversy, where the dragon Lucifer is now going after the seed of the woman, which are the descendants of the church, the last remnant part of the church. And we are told that they are characterized by people who keep the commandments of God and are imbued, if you will, blessed with the spirit of prophecy. All right, and the prophecies that they receive are representative of this period. Now, in addition to all of that, I want you to note that Revelation chapter 13 is a continuation, if you will, of that, not necessarily that vision, but certainly that path of the vision, right? So it's continuing in that whole group must be seen, those chapters can be seen as part of a group. All right, so the dragon is introduced. He has 7 heads and he has 10 horns upon his head. And that reminds us, once we hear 10 horns on a beast, we start to think about Daniel chapter 7, because in Daniel chapter 7, we were introduced to a lion, a bear, a leopard with 4 heads, and then a beast with a big head, if you will, but on the head he had 10 horns. Everybody remember that? So if you think about it, the 4th beast of Daniel chapter 7 was the culmination of these beasts that went before, of lion, bear, leopard, and then a beast that defied description. And then we were told in Daniel that something happened where after a time, and let's remember that sequence, after a time, 3 of the horns of the 4th beast fell down, and a new horn, a 11th horn came up that was thick and stumpy and had a voice like a man and spoke blasphemies. And on top of that, it persecuted the saints of God. And by now you are very, very accomplished Bible students, because we deduced and we were told in some cases, because Daniel is a little bit different from Revelation, in that the angel who gave the vision to Daniel interpreted a lot of parts of the visions. So we knew, and we now are well aware, that the lion represented the Babylonian Empire that existed when Daniel was there, and that the bear represented the Medo-Persian Empire that followed the Babylonians after they had covered and conquered most of Mesopotamia. And then subsequently they were replaced by the Greeks, held by Alexander the Great, who then gave way because of his death at a very young age to 4 of his generals who ran that place. So the leopard with 4 heads represents Greece. So far we've encountered 6 heads. We've had Babylon, the head of the lion, the head of the bear, second, and then we have 4 heads coming out of the leopard. So far, 4 heads. Notice that the beast in Revelation chapter 13 that comes out of the sea has 7 heads. So in Daniel chapter 7, listen to me carefully, because I'm shifting between talking about what happened in Daniel and then what happened in Revelation. In Daniel chapter 7, the 4-headed leopard is succeeded by a beast that also has a head. So now we're up to 7 heads. Everybody okay with that? So we've seen 7 heads in that vision so far. But the head of this beast also has 10 horns. And we said that represented the Roman Empire. And it is a very good representation of the Roman Empire, because by 476 AD, 10 barbarian tribes that surrounded and lived on the periphery of the Roman Empire to the west of Rome. They had invaded the Roman Empire, and after by 476, Rome, in its original civil authorities in the western part of the kingdom, which is around the Mediterranean Sea, was indistinguishable. What was clear by the historians was that you could distinguish 7 barbarian tribes that eventually became the modern day countries of Europe as we know them today. All right. Um, and as a result of that um, that change that was taking place, where you now have Rome almost in descent and you could barely distinguish it, and you have these 10 nations coming up. What happened was that the Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church, the Roman Christian Church, was the only thing that seemed to represent Rome in any specific way in the Western Roman Empire. And so the Eastern Emperor Justinian, who was then living in Constantinople, which is where modern day Turkey is today, would have given rights and powers and authorities, if you will, to the head of the church. And he said, in the face of all of these barbarian tribes, you are now the full-fledged representative of the Roman Empire. Interestingly, a lot of the barbarian tribes had a kind of, maybe because of their superstitious past, etc., they had a kind of reverence for the Christian church and the Roman church in particular, so that it was a legitimate strategy, if you will, by the Roman emperor to grant the church civil powers, because the church then was able to leverage not only its religious reverence that it held among the heathen nations, but it was also given the power with armies, etc., and legionaries, etc., to exercise civil power. And so what we then saw was that the little horn that came up after 3 horns had fell down, and it's interesting to note that the final ascent of the Roman Church, the Bishop of Rome, as a secular power in that period occurred after some of the Arians and stuff had been defeated by the Roman armies to allow him to come in. So indeed, three barbarian nations kind of gave way. The Visigoths and others gave way to allow the Roman church to become prominent, and it became the dominant force. So from 538 AD, where this all seemed to be concretized and really come into its head, if you will, from 538 AD all the way for about 1,000 years and more, and in fact, for exactly 1,260 years, the Roman church was effectively the Roman kingdom within the Mesopotamian, Middle Eastern area, Mediterranean Valley, Mediterranean Sea, that kind of thing, right? So in effect, one could argue that the Roman Empire that succeeded the Greeks had 2 phases of its existence. There was a civil phase with emperors and senate and presidents, etc., and governors and stuff. And then there was a religious political phase, which we call papal Rome, because it was run by the Pope at the time, who had the power. And they carried on for 1260 years. Why 1260 years? Because in 1798, with the rise of republicanism, the American Constitution, the American independence was already happening in 1776. 1789, the French Revolution was in full bloom. And so by 1798, the French identified, if you will, that the Roman Church was a true source of perpetuation of some of the dramas they were trying to overcome. And so they invaded Italy, and they captured the Pope. And that word captured is important because we'll come back to that today. He was held in captivity, and he was placed into a dungeon where he died, actually, in the dungeon. And at that time, historical writers would tell you that it seemed as if the church was dead. And it's interesting to note that in my readings this week, I was interested in that I encountered the word concordat, because we use the word concordat a lot in our education system here in Trinidad. And a concordat is really agreement between the government and the church in terms of how we carry out education. Well, back in early 1800s, as a matter of fact, as early as 1801, the same Napoleon who had captured Pope Pius VI at the time and threw him into prison had entered into a new agreement with a new pope who had emerged subsequent to that, and had established a concordat of peace that says, well, we'll give you a chance to try to flourish. So the church never really died, even though it was drastically wounded. And over time, the church has now continued to grow to the point where we know the church has very much established today. And last week we talked about the fact that just a few weeks ago, the Roman Catholic Pope, which is Pope Francis, was in Iraq and received a very important welcome by the Shiite Muslims who lived in that era, right? So that is, so interestingly, I made all of that to tell you that when we got to the sea beast in Revelation chapter 13, note the similarities, because he also has 7 heads, which is kind of saying he's representative of the nations that we saw in Daniel, and he also has 10 horns, which we know are representative of the Roman nation. So clearly, this sea beast that we met in Revelation, which I could conclude now, you all know that represented the Roman, the little horn period of the Roman Empire, which is religious political Rome, especially during the Dark Ages period. As a matter of fact, we are not meant to guess that, because the writings in the verses from 1 to 10 told us he will rule for 42 months, which is the same as 1260 days, which is the same as 1260 years, all right? So the first beast that comes up out of the sea, and it means sea, we are told in Revelation 17, which we'll come to later, means people. And we've seen references to sea and water representing people, even in some of the ancient prophet writings of Ezekiel and others. We begin to appreciate that this nation came up at the period where people were. In contrast, the land beast is coming up in a place where there are not a lot of people, and it looks very docile, very Christ-like, but eventually we are told in the very same verse, it speaks like a dragon, all right? So that is my quick synopsis. I hope you all didn't get lost, and let's pedal through as fast as we can. So I just reviewing what I told you a while ago to tell you that the Roman Empire is what we are focused on in particular, because there's a lot of similarities between that little horn description in Daniel 7 and the first beast of Revelation chapters 13, 1 to 10. So we know the identity of the first beast. It is Christian Rome. It is Rome in its ascendancy with religious, political Rome. It's papal Rome, as we like to call it in the literature. And we know its activities during that time. It would have persecuted the saints. But then it talks something here about the wound being healed. And we'll talk all about that in a very quick bit in a bit, right? And then we talked about the land beast. And then today we want to continue to focus on the image of the beast and its mark. All right. Now, when we looked at the first part, we came to some conclusions, but I want to just make sure you are fully aware. So we're going to do a quick read of the chapters or the verses. So it said, and just follow me quickly, because I know you're familiar with this, but I just want to make sure I don't take it for granted and some of the words stick in your head. And maybe by the repetition, you'll find that some things are sticking. All right. He said, I stood on the sand of the sea and I saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads. You now know what is the significance of these 7 heads, because it is representative of the lion head, the bear head, the 4 heads of the leopard, and the head of the 4th beast, right? So there's some similarities there. And the 10 horns of the 4th beast. So that is clearly a Roman orientation, if you will. And upon his horns were 10 crowns. So these are, of course, nations, diadems, representing nations. And the heads, upon his heads was and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. Once you hear that word, it evokes Daniel chapter 7, verse 25, and you know that the little horn was also accused of blasphemy. We'll talk about what blasphemy is, but very quickly, blasphemy just simply means you are now positioning yourself as God, and you think that you are God as opposed to God being God, all right? And we'll come to that. Verse 2 says, and the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion, and the dragon gave him his power and his seat and his great authority. This is spot on, because we know that religious political Rome received its power from the civil or political Roman Empire, right? What we call pagan Rome in most of the literature. And this is spot on, because this is exactly what happened in 538 AD. So now you are really comfortable reading these verses, because you are very familiar with what all of this means. He says, and I saw one of his heads. So we are talking about the heads of the beasts, which obviously, if we said that the beast had 7 heads and represented all the ones in the past, we are talking now about the Roman Empire, if you will, as it were, wounded to death, 1798, and his deadly wound was healed. So he quickly went on to tell us his deadly wound was healed. And our question is, remember Pastor Eddie last week asked us, can we say that the healing is complete now or not, or whether we are in the middle of the healing? We can come back and talk about that. But it says what we are clearly saying to us, which I'll come to the conclusions in a little bit. And all the world wondered after the beast. So just keep that in our heads. And they worshiped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like unto the beast, who is able to make war with him? So these are rhetorical questions. They are questions of awe and questions of wonder, if you will. Verse 5 says, and there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. Why does that sound familiar to Revelation, to Daniel 7:25? And power was given him to continue for 42 months, 1,260 years. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, what is going on in the heavenly tabernacle, and them that dwell in heaven, all right? Because they're obscuring the work in heaven. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and power was given him over all kingdom, kindreds, and tongues and nations. So there is something interesting here, because we know what this first part is. It's around the 1260 years. But this second part here seems to be talking about more than just Rome, because while the Roman Empire was persecuting the people in the Dark Ages, you still had the Muslims and other nations doing what they're doing. But the way this piece is written, it seems to be suggesting that that beast will at one point control the whole world. And we need to think about whether that has happened yet or is about to happen in the future. If any man have an ear, let him hear. He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. I told you keep attention to that word captive, because later on in 1790, the Pope himself, who had put people into captive and put them into dungeons and put them into places where they were killed by lions and stuff, he himself went into captivity. And then he says, he that killeth with the sword must be killed by the sword. It's interesting to note that the Roman Pope Pius VI, 1798, when he was captured by an army, which is, of course, their main weapon is a sword, and he was put to death by that army, all right? Meaning, of course, he was put into the dungeon and he died under the army's control. Here are the patience of the saints, and here is the patience and faith of the saints, all right? I kind of want to get so accustomed to that word. All right, so here is the patience and the faith of the saints, which in spite of all of this bad news, Jesus is still reminding us that if we keep the faith and we remain patient, he sees us as his saints who he's keeping under control. So we drew some conclusions, which we will just quickly repeat today, right? The beast represents an earthly kingdom, as was represented in Daniel, right? Rising out of the sea implies that the kingdom arose from a populous place, which we said is Mesopotamia, modern-day Europe at that point in time. Compared to Daniel 7, the beast is a Roman nation, right? The dragon is giving the beast its power, its seat, and its authority, refers to the religious political Rome from 538 AD. So again, this is all stuff that you know. The reference to 42 months is the 1260-year period from 538 AD to 1798. It must blow your mind sometimes how accurate this prophecy was, and how well it was fulfilled, which clearly says that God has a plan, which is our theme for this Bible class, right? The head of the beast being wounded occurs after the dragon gave power. So note the sequence, that the fact that the beast was wounded, that language came up after we were told that he received the power, the seat, and the authority of the dragon, which is the beast before him. By the way, calling civil Rome the dragon is consistent with Revelation chapter 12, because we know it was civil Rome who was referred to as a dragon who tried to take the child coming out of the woman and putting her to death. I hope that is clear to everybody. So it then is basically saying that after 538 AD, 1798 is when the French brought about what seemed to be an end to the Roman Church, right? So that is what the wounding means. When the church was captured, it looked like that was the end of it. But it then says the wound will be healed, which means that sometime after 1798, but before Christ comes. Now, I want you to just take a pause here and remember that when we study the little horn in Daniel chapter 7, we encounter this whole wounding at the time, and maybe not a specific a term. But the next thing we were introduced after that beast and the little horn, we were introduced to a judgment taking place in heaven, which we know is a pre-advent or investigative judgment that is taking place in heaven. And then we were told that after that, Christ would come and he would reign and he would reward his saints, etc. In this case, when we get to the point of 1798, before Revelation doesn't get into the pre-investigative judgment at this point, because that has already been covered in Daniel. But what it gets into is the activities of this same beast that was wounded beyond its period of 1798. So while the investigative judgment is going on, one could argue what Revelation is going to give us are details and insights into the activities of this beast as it continues its reign, albeit in a different form and albeit after it has been wounded and it is now healed. That is the details that we're going. So it's happening simultaneously as there is an investigative judgment going on in heaven. And you need to always remember that, because you need to remember that when things look bad upon the earth, God is preparing a place for us in heaven. All right? So the reference to the whole world marveling after the beast implies that the beast will regain a prominent position and standing in world affairs. But what is clear, though, is that two classes of worshippers will emerge. Those who worship God and Christ, since their names will be written in the book of life of the Lamb, and those who worship the heel beast or continue to be an agent of that beast, right? So clearly, two classes of worshippers will occur. We talked about the captivity, which is what I told you, do solo like. So I was kind of pulling out a little local parlance there, but it's ready to say that what we talked about earlier, the Roman nation captured and put people to torture, and then itself was captured and tortured through the Pope, who was captured in 1798. And then the living saints are encouraged to be patient and to keep the faith, because God has a plan. All right, so that was it. Let's quickly get to the land beast, because I want to move a lot faster now. So in verse 11, it says, I beheld another beast. So clearly this is in addition to the first beast, he sees another beast. One immediately gets the impression from a sequence point of view, this is after he had seen the first beast coming out of the sea. All right, so this beast is occurring sometime after the period in which 538 took place and that kind of thing. And the first beast got its power and its authority and was doing all its drama, right? So he says, I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and it had two horns like a lamb, but it spoke. I put but you know the language in the verses, and he spoke as a dragon. I put but there because, I mean, I think John, I sometimes try to put myself in the mind of John. He has seen all these visions. He's seen all these beasts that looking terrible and frightful. And then he sees one that looks like a lamb. And he might be saying, all right, at last I get something that looks a little bit more friendly. But quickly, he is brought back to reality, because in the same verse, without much fanfare, this just says, after he sees what looks like a lamb beast, it speaks like a dragon. So we have real drama going on there, right? So he came up out of the earth. Again, if we agree that seas represented a populated place, and we are reasonably in a good place to conclude that this is a nation that comes up out of the earth. So it's a nation that, unlike the nations that we saw before that were really successors of the previous nations, this nation is not a successor of anybody. This is a nation that kind of comes up on its own. It is not a nation that was formed after another nation went down. It is almost as if it standing up on its own, right? It looks like a lamb, but it speaks like a dragon. It's a peaceful nation at the beginning, but it acts with violence. And then we had some conversations about this last week because we agreed that even in its beginning, there were violence. When we talk about what happened with the um, native Indians who were on the plantations and who were in the land before these pilgrims landed and stuff, and what they did, and then how they treated with their slavery and that kind of thing. One of our students who was on last week, she reminded me that, and because we talked about that last week, and we said that I think a question came as to whether or not how could these Christian people carry out such difficult acts and such if they were fleeing from persecution in Europe and coming to America, they were now kind of these difficult acts. And we're reminded from the historical record that a lot of times these so-called pilgrims, as they came across, when they enacted some of these laws to put in slavery and to deal with some of the Indians and stuff, they saw them as less than human. And in some cases, if they were human, they almost saw it as a sort of proselytization and evangelism, in that they were trying to convince them about Christianity, which is a strange way to try to convince people about Christianity. But it is not unheard of, because during the periods of the Inquisitions, during the periods of the Crusades, force was also used to try to force people to convert to Christianity. All right, so there is some precedent, if you will, with respect to that. Is given authority after the deadly wound of the first beast, and it still has authority after being healed, and it performs great signs, right? So basically, we pull the quote which we got from Stefanovic when he said that while the first beast was terrifying in appearance, the second beast was lamb-like, in contrast to the sea beast that had 10 monstrous horns, but it soon started to talk and look like a dragon, right? So, but clearly this is a nation. This is a nation that comes up out of a place where there are not a lot of people and looks very Christ-like, because the lamb, once you say lamb in Revelation, we're evoking Jesus Christ, looks very Christ-like. All right. So we talked about the fact that a lot of the people during the Dark Ages period fled Europe and came to America. And we had the pilgrims, you have Thanksgiving, all of that is traditional from that period. And they would have formed the nation of America. So by 1776, they would have established their independence from Europe and from Britain and become its own nation in this huge landmass, and develop two important principles. And the principles were civil liberty. Behold, all men, behold this truth, that all men are created equal and they have the right to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all that kind of thing. So civil liberty, and then religious liberty was part of the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. So it was really understanding that in their eyes, they saw a separation of church and state. You know, Mervyn Maxwell, in his book God Cares Too, gives a very deep analysis of this, and he said that America, the United States of America, was the only nation around that period, and from that old world period, if you will, around that period in that century, who didn't have a state-sponsored church, because the other nations would have sponsored their church. They would have acted as guardians of their church. In America, you were allowed to worship whoever you want. The different churches were allowed to flourish. Protestantism flourished. The Lutherans and others came, and they were able to carry out their religion, and then a lot of other Protestant religions arose in America around that time. So religious liberty was a pillar, civil liberty was a pillar. One could argue that they represented two horns of the nation. So in a way, when we see a lamb-like beast with two horns on its head, two soft horns, two horns that don't look fearsome, that don't look intimidating as the 10 horns in the other beast, one could very well say that this was America with its two pillars of liberty, civil liberty. You had the freedom to be who you want to be and to not be enslaved, etc. Of course, if you were not of the right complexion, and then and religious liberty. At least those were the founding principles. But we also know that there's a kind of schizophrenia, a kind of split personality taking place, because while America speaks like a lamb, it behaves as a dragon. And it's interesting that we are studying that in today, 2021, because we don't need to be convinced of that. We have been through 2020 and the George Floyd stuff. We've been through the civil rights movement of the 1960s. We are now, today, this week, dealing with what seems to be, we talked about that last week and it happened again this week, the rising hate crimes against Asian Americans, because they are now seen as the originators of the coronavirus, and the fact that it was called the Kung flu and the China flu. All of a sudden, there's been this huge attack against Asian Americans to the point that 8 people were killed in Atlanta last week. So this week, so you begin to appreciate that this dichotomous view of America, where she says one thing officially but does something else, that is not new. And clearly it would have been happening way back then. And it seems as if this characterization of lamb and dragon is well placed in representing America. So we talked about the fact that one of the things we first established was that when they came together, they attempted to have civil liberty and religious liberty as two separate things. But over time, you found that civil liberty and religious liberty started to intermingle. And we talked last week about the religious right and the fact that so many evangelicals were in support of Trump, and so many were doing stuff that wanted to promote a certain agenda when it comes to pro-life, for instance, and not sponsoring with state funds. That is a big argument in the US. Mustn't use state funds to perform abortions, etc. And then it moved into whether or not you should have religious emblems in the public schools and all that kind of thing. So over time, there's been a serious morphing, intermingling, if you will, of civil and religious liberty, and our prophetic anticipation is that soon enough we will get to a place where civil liberty and religious liberty will come together again, and it will result in forced worship. And our basis for that is that we have seen it before. So when Daniel chapter 3 and Nebuchadnezzar put up his golden image, it was him curtailing civil liberty and him also curtailing religious. You couldn't worship who you want, and if you didn't worship who I say to worship, you'll be put to death. He curtailed their civil liberties. In Daniel chapter 6, same thing happened. The King Darius said, you could only worship me for the next month or 30 days or whatever. If you didn't do it, you end up in the lion's den. Daniel ended up in the lion's den. Jesus Christ was crucified because, again, civil liberties and religious liberties were curtailed. The Jews says that he is claiming to be God, and we have a law that says he must be put to death, and the Romans put him to death. All right? Then we saw it during the 1260 years. We're seeing it again coming up here during this period. So we are clear that the lamb-like beast coming out of the land is America. And then we got to the various verses which we try to explain. Verse 12 says, and he exercises all the power of the first beast. So this is the revelator is talking about the lamb-like beast, saying he exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them that dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. All right, so let's just deal with that. We will go to the explanations or the understanding as we put it here. So when he uses the word "and," as we did at the beginning here, he is attempting to explain, because he concludes verse 11 by saying, it looked like a lamb, but it spake like a dragon. And it's almost as if he's continuing to explain, well, why do I say it spake like a dragon, right? So that's why the "and" is almost a conjunction that joins the previous verse to this verse. And then he says, he, meaning the land beast or the second beast, behaves like, so he is, that's what exercise that means, he behaves like and works with all the power of the first beast. The first beast was religious political Rome. Now, this is extremely important. The first beast is not civil Rome. The sea beast that came out in Revelation 13 is religious political Rome, where church and state had already come together. Civil liberty and religious liberty were already curtailed, and it was governed by the head of the nation, which was the head of the church. All right, so when he says that the land beast, the one coming out of the land, will behave like the first beast, we are suggesting here and we are concluding that what the revelator is telling us is that America, let's be very specific now, will at some point in its history merge civil liberties and religious liberties to the point where it starts to look like religious political Rome during the Dark Ages period. Hope everybody got that. I'm making sure that's sinking. So the first beast of the religious political Rome, who combined the power of the church and the state and used that united power to force worship as per the church's doctrines by all members of the state. Those pure and true Christians who did not follow were persecuted, and a great many hid in caves and also fled to the New World and the USA. That's a historical fact, right? But it is saying to us that the same place they fled to and the same nation that was fledgling and emerged out of the earth and now becomes Christ-like in its appearance because it's offering civil liberty and religious liberty, and it sounds like a good place to serve your God, etc. That nation is at some point in time going to transform, going to evolve into a state where it is going to curb religious and civil liberties with a sort of draconian authoritative approach that will cause people to experience forced worship. Are we there yet? Maybe not. I don't think we're there yet. But clearly this is pointing, if you will, to something that will happen in soon and in fact, right? Then he says, so if you go back to the original writing, we can say, and he exercised all the power of the first beast before him, that is the Roman nation, if you will, under the Christian church, and cause it. So when it says cause it here, we have interpreted that to say force and or influence. But know that the first beast, that is the sea beast, also forced. So we are really reflecting the same thing, right? The earth and all that there in them which dwell therein. So there's an international event. I said to you that when we read that, this is more than the 1260 years. There's something to come. This is something to come which suggests that the United States of America will use its power and its influence to curtail civil and religious liberties to the point that people start to worship the first beast, all right, which is the Roman Empire, which is now healed from the womb. So this is clearly sometime after 1798. And given where we are today and where we understand history is, this is clearly something to happen in the future, all right? We're using our historicist lens at this point in time. To worship, which is to treat as God and reverence the image of Daniel. Remember that image? The first beast, religious political Rome, whose deadly wound, we're talking about the damage in 1780, it was healed, and the church regains its worldly influence. Everybody okay with this? We talked about this last week, so you find that I kind of rushed this one a little bit because I just want to make sure you remember all of this, right? So we have covered verse 12. Let's go to verse 13. Verse 13 says, and he doeth great wonders, still talking about the land beast. He doeth great wonders that he maketh fire come down from heaven and the earth in the sight of men. And by now you know that this is invoking 1 Kings chapter 18, Elijah on the mountain with the prophets of Baal, and the fact that when they saw the fire come down, they now believe that Elijah was representing God and that the God of heaven and Jehovah of the Jews is the real God. So what this text is saying to us, figuratively, I suppose, is that at some point in time, America will perform great signs and wonders to convince people that she is right, that America is right in what she's doing, and that she has the divine right to do what she's doing, right? So it is not just miracles. I mean, I would think there are all kind of miracles happening in the US today. When I think about how they're able to carry this perseverance rover on the Mars, I am fascinated by that, and I think that that is a great miracle. It's a scientific miracle, but that doesn't tell me anything about them being godlike. All right, but it seemed to be suggesting that in concert with this rule, with this nature that the nation will adopt, where it is will now force people to worship Rome in some regard, that in addition to its influence and its power to do that, there will also be displays of power, of miracle type behavior that will also serve to make people think that this is the true God, right? And we talked about the deception that came with that in the past. So if you thought I was talking about deception, it's because I was drawing upon verse 14, because it says, with those signs and miracles that he performs, he deceived them that dwell upon the earth by means of those miracles, which he had the power to do in the sight of the first beast. That is a powerful term. It almost means animated, activated by the first beast, saying to them that dwell upon the earth that they should make an image to the beast, which had a wound by a sword and did live. So these are really powerful summary texts. And if we were to deconstruct it the way we've been doing the others, deceivet, meaning it is this deceivet reminds us of Jesus before he goes to crucifixion on the Mount of Olives, and when he says to the disciples that many will come claiming to be Christ, they could deceive even the very elect. So this is our representation of that, right? That is suggesting that the land-like beast, which is the beast from the land, which is the United States, will seek to facilitate false representations of Jesus Christ. And it will deceive them that dwell upon the earth. So everybody will see that and be deceived by the means of these manifestations, which he, the America, had the power to do in the sight of the first beast, which is the Roman Empire, now under the church's control. Saying to them that dwell upon the earth, again, this is our international perspective, that they should make an image, or this is something we have to keep our minds on, because an image is really a likeness that looks like something that is real, right? So some people say that the child is a spitting image of the parents. It doesn't mean that the child and the parents are the same. It just means that the child, looks like the parent, all right? So in a similar way, we are expecting then that there will be a system of religion and coming together of civil and religious powers that will look like how it used to be during the Dark Ages period. Are you with me? We are not defining this in any specific way, but we know enough to suggest that what may emerge is a coming together of civil and religious liberties to the point that they are curtailed in much the same way that happened in the Dark Ages period, and that will be a system of governance, church and state, right? And that it will be very much reminiscent of the first beast. But when it says make an image to the beast, we begin to appreciate this is not just something that looked like the Roman period, but it is something that includes the Roman period in its present form. So in other words, the Roman Catholic Church, which is the remnant of that period. That is the only thing that is remaining of that period. When we talk about the Roman, the religious political Rome, we are talking about the Roman Catholic Church, because the head of the church, the pontiff, has religious and political power. I talked about that before, and we said that he has the designation of a head of state because of the fact that the Vatican City has its own autonomy, which Mussolini gave them in 1929. All right, so that is also a reflection of the healing that is taking place. So he is now alive, he has power, and he's creating. So this is presenting a scenario that says sometime we can expect in the future America will use its power and its authority to to um to enable some sort of decree, direction, desire of the Roman Catholic Church to the point where the entire world will follow that, and it will be supported by coercion, which is force, but it will also be supported by miraculous manifestations, which will in some way persuade. So it's both coercion and persuasion. Everybody okay with that? That will bring that together. I know I'm going a little bit fast. I want to kind of pause a little bit and see if there are any questions or comments. Anybody? You all okay? All right. All of this is revisionary. We covered this last week. That's why I was going so fast. So let's kind of hit a little bit of slower pace now. It says, and he had power. So verse 14 introduced the fact that an image to the first beast would be created. Now, I could paint a picture of myself and put it on a wall, or take a picture to a camera and put it on a wall. But if I could turn that picture and give it life, that's a whole different ball game altogether, right? Because then I'm more than just a painter or photographer. I am able to imbue life into that whole thing, right? So that is extremely important. So it says, and he had the power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. So you begin to understand coercion coming in here, because we are saying that. So let's go to the breakdown, right? And he, meaning the land beast, the USA, had the power, which means he has the political and the worldly power and influence to give life. We call the creation of man in Genesis, where God took man from the ground. He made a form of man, and he call it an image, but that is a good way to refer to it. He made a form of man in terms of a physical being, and then he breathed life into the being and gave it life through the breath of life. In a way, the dragon, the devil, is mimicking that by suggesting that somewhere in the future we will have something that looks like the old version of the Roman Empire under the power of the popes and the pontiff papal Rome, and that some or the other America will bring life into that image, that thing that looks like that period. All right, so I'm trying not to get too specific because we haven't been given much more to be too specific. When we get to the later chapters, we will cover some more clues that will help us understand how the system will work. But we want to just move with what we have heard so far, right? So basically, he's saying that it will give life unto the likeness or the system of church and state united of the first beast, but that the image of the beast should both speak. Now, our nation speaks through its laws and its constitutions. That's how our nation speaks. So it is again invoking that there is a lot of civil liberties that will be curtailed through laws and constitutions. Now, a lot of you might be saying, and I told you last week that I myself, when I was a younger guy, reading all of this thing, I thought it looked really far-fetched. But after 2020, is this far-fetched? In 2020, did we not see laws being put in place that said you cannot go out at certain times, you cannot assemble with more than 6 feet between you, you cannot have more than 10 people in a group, you must wear a mask? Did we see that? Didn't we see that all over the world in a very common way, in a united way that seemed to suggest? So I don't consider coronavirus the image of the beast, but certainly coronavirus has given us the foresight that kind of worldly control is possible, because we have now seen it played out in this incident of the coronavirus, and therefore it can happen again. I told you last week that after 9/11 and the Patriotic Act that came out of the US, to a large extent, the mechanisms that came in terms of how we travel and TSA and stuff, that was mimicked all over the world because there was a kind of general acceptance that something had happened, and the freedom at which people travel now needed to be curtailed and checked. So clearly, when events happen in the world that evolves and becomes a common enemy, it is not uncommon for the world to react in concert, to react together. And therefore, this text is pointing to the fact that somewhere in the future, and I would suggest not too far away, we can very well find the world acting in concert, coming together, if you will. But unfortunately, the coming together is not to prevent us from becoming infected with a virus or to help us get vaccines and stuff. But the coming together is about worshiping a nation, a system of religion that seems to be far different from what God expects. I could say that because the beast, the first beast, represented religious political Rome, who practiced a form of religion that was not aligned to the Bible and forced people to do that, right? So this is basically bringing back that same sort of conversation into play. And I remind you of Daniel chapter 3 and chapter 6. Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego in the fiery furnace. It was the state that was united with the church that were putting people into persecution during that period. And we have seen that in the past, and I'm saying that could happen again. All right, let's keep going. So just some emphasis here. When he says he spake like a dragon, I reminded you that how does a nation speak? Well, it speaks through its laws and its legislative bodies. So that is just to remind you that this nation will be able to speak. Now, it is, if you look at the historical records and you go detail, America putting laws that are based on religious beliefs is nothing strange. That has happened before. And I mean, all this pro-life conversations, a lot of that is driven by a religious view and a religious thinking, as opposed to just secularism and people saying, well, it's the right thing to do. It is driven a lot of times by a religious understanding. All right. So let's go to Revelation 13, 16 to 17. It says, and he, our verse 16 says, he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell, save he that had a mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. So by the time we get to verse 16, it is putting further explanations to what we covered in verses 14 and 15. So when we take our references that we have put in brackets, let's see what it says. It says, and he, meaning the land beast, USA, will cause all, another international worldwide appeal, small and great, rich and poor, again focusing on the international scope of this thing, to receive. That word receive has implications and carries with it the context of imposition. In other words, he will force us to have a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads. And you could remember what happened in Deuteronomy 6 when people had to have marks to protect them. But we'll come back to that in a bit. And no man might be able to buy or sell. So it invokes a kind of economic sanction. They're suggesting that if you have the mark of the first beast that is given to you by the power of the land beast, then you are okay. And if you don't, then you will be subject to economic sanction. You cannot participate in the economy of the world. Now, I know some people have fears about that because, and I'm saying this cautiously, but there's a lot of conversation, especially in Europe, around vaccine passports and suggesting that if you don't have something indicating you have been vaccinated on your passport. You won't be able to go to work. You won't be able to go to travel. People would accept you in their stores, etc. That is just an early reflection of this concept of where the world will could become united in basically keeping people out of economic participation because of some other larger context or some other greater objective that they're trying to satisfy. So this is what this is saying. And then it says, who had the mark or the name of the beast. So we want to talk about that, or the number of his name, right? So let's talk about receiving the mark. Um, it seems to be suggesting that all classes of human society, because it says small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, are commanded to receive the mark of the beast, right? So let's keep that term in our head, the mark of the beast. And that to receive the mark of the beast means to belong, because that word mark is more than just in its original. If you go back to the etymology of this word mark, going back to the original Hebrew and Greek and stuff, it is really meant to be a stamp of ownership. It's like how people had coat of arms in the old days. Today, if you see the Trinidad and Tobago coat of arms on a vehicle, you know that is the president or the prime minister because it belongs to the state. So this mark here, that word that is used, is a word that is reflective of ownership. So basically, I could put that in the brackets. I didn't do that, but I could say, so we're basically saying the people who will be allowed to buy and sell are those who belong to the beast, those who have the sign of ownership to the beast. We need to ask ourselves, what is that? What could possibly be a sign of ownership? Is it a literal tattoo? Is it a chip or something? Which is a lot of times people think that was is. And we want to kind of deconstruct that a little bit. The mark of the beast is thus the antithesis of God's seal. Remember Revelation 14:1 talked about people being sealed on their foreheads. I'm coming to that in a bit. So just as the seal identified those who belong to God, the mark of the beast identified those who belong and worship the beast. Just keep that little bit of conclusions clear in your head. Everybody okay with this so far? All classes, poor, rich, free, bond, will receive the mark. That's what is the scenario that is being presented here. I'm saying to you that that word mark is more than just a tattoo or outward show. It is also indicative of ownership, so that the mark is reflective of ownership. I have argued, and I think it is well accepted. Everybody knows it. Some of the commentators have also said it, and we just accept it, that when we say in your forehead and in your hand, it is indicative of those who have a mental acceptance of the concept, as well as those who have just doing it to comply. So I said to you, and I think when we were doing the last Bible class, we used to use an example. When I take Eid holiday from work, and I stay home from not working for Eid al-Fitr. For my Muslim friends, that day is a mental, it's something in their foreheads. They have accepted that that is a holy day, the end of Ramadan, and they therefore need to spend some time with their families and worship. But when I take it, I am not a Muslim. I am following the holiday decree that says I must take the day and I could stay home and not work. I'm doing that with my hands, if you will. I'm following with my hands. I don't necessarily follow with my head. I don't believe in the practice and in the festival, but I'm nonetheless complying and taking a holiday because obviously because I less like to be home and I want the time off. But the fact is, in doing that, I am complying, if you will, as it were, with my hands, my right hands, because my hands are how I work and my form of action, while my head is where I have mental assent and mental belief and mental conclusion. Everybody okay with that? So that terminology, hand and head, right head and forehead and your right hand, don't go around thinking you're looking for somebody with 666 on their forehead or tattooed in their hand. It may very well be, and I'll come back to show you how we can conclude that, looking at some Old Testament references, it can very well be referred to the fact that there is a mental acceptance of the truth And that motivates the action, as well as there are some who will simply comply because that is the law. And that is what he asked me to do. It don't mean that I agree with it, or I accept it, or I believe it, but I do it anyway. All right? So let's talk about what specifically is the mark of the beast. When we're doing Revelation chapter 7, and we're doing the sealing of God's servants, we talked about the fact that the issue of using marks was something that is common something that occurred in the Old Testament. So in Ezekiel chapter 9, verses 3 to 4, we are told, and he called to the man clothed with linen, which had the writer's inkhorn on his side. He had a bottle with ink and a pen to write, right? And the Lord said unto him, go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and set a mark upon the foreheads of the men, that sign and that cry, and that cry for all the abominations that be done in the midst thereof. So in the old days, it was normal, or Ezekiel in this period would have put marks because Israel was into huge apostasy, and they would have put marks upon the foreheads of the people to distinguish those who were true to God and who were lamenting the fact that Israel had become apostatized versus those who were apostatized. So when you looked upon the people, those with the mark on their foreheads represented God's people, and those without the mark represented people who were not following God. We now have in this mark of the beast, I could just say that quickly, even though we'll come to the conclusion, a reverse of that. Because in the mark of the beast, I'm suggesting that if you don't have the mark in your forehead or in your hand, you can't buy or sell. It is suggesting that if you do not have a sign representing you are owned by the beast and you are owned by God, you are on the outside going to see persecution rather than being protected. In the case of Ezekiel, it was that if you had the mark of God upon your forehead, you were now seen as being owned by God and protected by him. So this inkhorn and putting a mark was really a way of distinguishing and representing those who were faithful in the midst of apostasy, those who were faithful, and therefore, when the time of destruction came, you kind of had those people protected. You will recall as well that when the Passover was about to happen and Israel were looking to leave Egypt, that God also told them to put a mark upon their doorposts with blood, so that when the avenging angel passed that night, their children will be saved, right? So again, I'm saying to you that this concept of a mark, a sign of ownership, a sign that you belong to God, it is not unique to Revelation. We've seen it before in the Old Testament, all right? And then we are also told in Revelation chapter 3, verses 10 to 11, because thou hast kept the word of my patience, I will keep thee from the hour of temptation which shall come upon the world to try them that dwell upon the earth. Behold, I come quickly, hold fast till I come. This was to the church of Laodicea, right? So God was saying that if you followed his word, it acts as a form of protection and a seal, if you will, right? So when we discuss this in Revelation chapter 7, I'm just simply using back the old slides. We said that in ancient times, sealing had a variety of meanings, right? Documents were sealed to validate their contents, but the fundamental meaning of sealing was ownership. A seal impression on an object designated ownership. In other words, if you got a letter and you saw a stamp on it that looks like a government stamp, you know that what is inside there is some letter from a ministry or something like that, right? In the old days, when you saw a stamp or a seal, nobody could break that unless you had the authority to break it, or the king gave you the authority, right? Paul also talked about the fact that the Lord knows those who are his, right? And he said that those who have his name, which is what Revelation 14 tells us, having the name of God in their foreheads, signify the ownership of the saved. In other words, if we allow God's character to live within us, which is what we talked about when we did Revelation chapter 7, then we follow God's name and we have the seal of his name. So let's read these slides, right? It says, the seal of the living God appears to be the same as the Father's name in Revelation 14:1. both the seal of God and his name are placed in people's foreheads. So before we even got to this thing about mark of the beast, we were given a real clarity around what it means to be sealed with God's name in the last day, which is to have his character. And we then said that was in our foreheads, which means it doesn't mean that we physically have God's name stamped on our heads, but we behave and we are imbued with God's character, and there's a belief in it that allows us to follow after Christ. Paul says, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. God's name is a term often used to represent his character. The meaning seems to be that Christ seals his end-time people by developing in each of them a beautiful reproduction of his lovely character. That came from Maxwell, God Cares, chapter 2. And then Ellen White herself says, but all who follow the Lamb in heaven will first have followed him on earth in trustful, loving, willing obedience, followed him not fretfully and capriciously, in other words, by just whim and fancy, but confidently, truthfully, as a flock follows a shepherd. So God's character imbued in my character and replacing who I am with his character is his mark that I am owned by God. But is that only it? So now we remember that, let's go back to the mark of the beast. If the beast is the Roman church in the time when it was in full ascendancy during the Dark Ages period, but now when we read these verses that we are covering in verses 16 to 17, it seems to be suggesting, and even verses 15, that the land beast will enable a system, an image of the beast, a system of governance that will force us to worship the first beast. It's not about going back in time, it's about worshiping it in the form that exists now, which is the Roman Catholic Church. So the Roman Church will become, if you will, a prominent figure in world affairs, and it will be supported by the United States at some point in time, and that they will ensure that people are, that ownership, that alliance between church and state is best reflected in some sort of mark, some sort of activity that reflects the ownership of this image to the beast, right? Now, we just said that if I have God's character in him, it's almost if I'm marked with God's character. So we need to ask ourselves, what is this thing that we will be following that represents the authority of the Roman church? We need to think about that. Now, we must realize that this thing is not about a chip or a mark on your head, right? Because the beast is symbolic, the image is symbolic, the name is symbolic, the number is symbolic, the seal is symbolic, and the mark, therefore, must be symbolic. If we compare that to Daniel, what we realize is that in the describing the little horn in Daniel, we went through the same thing, right? Lion, bear, leopard, terrible, 10 horns, speaks great things. We talk about the blasphemies, reigns for 1260 years. And then the eighth thing it said was, it will seek to change time and laws. Everybody okay with that? That was what we studied. When we get to Revelation 13, a similar sequence is being followed. But when we get to the eighth thing, we are talking about the mark of the beast. In other words, the reason we have lined this up this way is to suggest that there is clearly a correlation. There is clearly a representation that this role of the little horn in seeking to change time and laws is symbolically represented by the mark of the beast in Revelation. In Daniel, we are told that the little horn, which is the Roman church now imbued with political power, will seek to change times and laws. It will do persecution and all that kind of thing. But we are now told that in Revelation, that instead of getting into that time and laws, what we are told about is almost all the other things, except when we got to that eighth thing, is that to talk about a mark of the beast. I begin to conclude that there is a strong correlation between changing times and laws and this thing that is being referred to as a mark of the beast. Everybody was with me on that? Let's also be clear that the central issue which we encountered when we looked at the first beast is about worship. Who will worship the beast versus whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. So we know for sure that Daniel 7 said that a little horn will seek to change time and laws. Well, we know that one of the things that the church tried to change in its last incarnation during the Dark Ages period, and certainly during those early centuries, was the day that is designated as the day for Sabbath worship. So, of course, this is um, a quotation from a document that says, of course, the Catholic Church claims that the change was her act, and the act is a marker for ecclesiastical power and authority in religious matters. There's a huge compliance to Sunday worship in the world today. And the origins of that Sunday worship is back to the Roman Empire and the Roman Church. That is just a fact of life. All right. There's very little, I mean, except for some Muslims who may hold Friday as sacred, the Christian world is really divided between Sunday worshippers in a very fundamental way and those who worship on the seventh day of the week, right? Sabbath worshippers. Sunday, first day of the week versus seventh day of the week. Other than that, there's very little you could use to distinguish any two parties within the Christian world. I mean, everybody talks about Jesus Christ, everybody sings great songs, etc. Some eat something, some eat certain things here, but the real sign of demarcation seems to be on the days on which people worship, right? And so you may find that those who worship on the first day of the week, they are seen as in the majority, and those who worship on the seventh day of the week, they are seen as in a minority. All right. In 1923, the Catholic record says Sunday is our mark of authority. Know the term they use, eh? The church is above the Bible, and this transference of Sabbath observance is proof of that. In other words, it's saying, and I think these are all well-intentioned in their eyes, that they can make changes, and one of the changes they can make is to worship on Sunday. And they will have all kind of reasons for that, about the fact that Christ rose on the first day and therefore it should be the day of observance. But we all know that historically it is tied to syncretism and bringing in certain worship. Now, how does the Bible view this Sabbath thing? Is it so important? Is it a big issue for us? Well, there are two texts that we should focus on. You know, there was a time when the elders of Israel, in the heights of the apostasy, they came to the prophet Ezekiel to reason with him and inquire of the Lord as to what happened. And the Lord gave Ezekiel a number of visions and directions to speak to them. And it is well captured in Ezekiel chapter 20. I will advise you to take your time, and that is a good study to read of how God felt disappointed over the fact that the Israelites didn't always keep his laws and his statutes. Let me also say to you that this breaking away from keeping the Sabbath from 7th day of the week to the first day of the week, the Israelite nation also were very negligent and very disobedient when it came to Sabbath keeping. Sometimes it wasn't that they substitute another day, they just simply didn't observe it at all. So when God is talking to Ezekiel, he says, wherefore I caused them to go forth out of the land of Egypt. So he's saying, I brought them out of Egypt and brought them into the wilderness. He's given his historical account. And I gave them my statutes, his laws, and showed them my judgments, which if a man do, he shall live in them. And then he says, moreover, also, I gave them my Sabbaths. So that's okay. You could stop there and say, well, yes, That was part of the statutes. Well, look what he says. Look what God says when he talks to Ezekiel. He says, it is to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord that sanctify them. So in other words, God was saying to Israel that this Sabbath you just castigate and throw away, and you're not taking on. That was supposed to represent the fact that I am your Lord, and I am the one who can sanctify you, because the Sabbath really is a commandment that speaks to creation. It's the only commandment that invokes creation. It talks about the fact that God created the world in 6 days and he rested on the 7th day, and we should therefore bless and hallow it. So the fact is, if you every Sabbath that we keep, we are reminded, we are humble. We are reminded that we cannot make ourselves, we cannot bring things into existence. We are really recipients of God's grace and his creative power, and we give God all the glory. Is everybody okay with that? Look what then he then says in that same verse, that same chapter, sorry. In verse 20 he says, which is the part as highlighted. Well, let me start from verse 19. He says, I am the Lord your God, walk in my statutes and keep my judgments and do them. So God has been very commanding to his people because they've been delinquent, and he's trying to get them to come back, right? And then he says, hallow my Sabbaths. In other words, keep them holy, observe them, and they shall be a sign. Look at that word sign. That is synonymous with the word mark. So it is a sign, it shall be a mark between you and me, that you may know that I am the Lord your God. So God saw this Sabbath as something that represented his sign of ownership. Now, cast your mind back to what we just talked about in Revelation chapter 7 and 14 about what God sealing us with his character. And you begin to appreciate that Sabbath observance is not about hand and head. You know, I just told you that I could observe Eid al-Fitr in my hand, but not in my head. I can do the things. God doesn't want that with the Sabbath, because God is saying that when you observe the Sabbath, it is really because you are sealed with his character, and you really want to observe his character and do what he wants. Is that okay? So this Sabbath observance by itself is not going to save us, but Sabbath observance is a reflection of the fact that we are owned by God. How are we owned by God? When God's character is dominant in my life, as opposed to my human character, the character I was born in sin and shaped me iniquity with. That is subdued, that is put away. And what takes precedence is Christ's character in my life. Christ's character in my life creates within me a desire to do what God wants. And therefore, I want to go after what God has asked and observe him in all my ways. I want to stop here because, again, we are at a closing point, and I think we have put a lot on the table to just let it soak in a little bit. But we need to finish off this question of the mark of the beast, and then we need to figure out what the name of the beast is and the number. What does that 666 mean, right? So we will, I know every time I tell you I'm going to start back where we stop, when Mark can give you some review, but I thought I should just review because of the fact that some people are joining in for the first time this week after they missed last week. But I promise that next week we will continue from here and try to close off these sets of verses, because this is really, really important, and it sets the tone for what is going to come, particularly in Revelation chapter 17, where this whole concept of false religion and forcing people to worship the beast will be further explored and expanded and exploded as we take a look at that going forward. Everybody okay with that? I know it's some of you tell me keep going, but you all say that, but when I get in trouble, you're not there to help me, right? So let's just finish where we are today. Our closing text is the same as last week. Peter and his friend said, then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we will obey God rather than men. my message in this whole Revelation chapter 13 is that what it will come down to is whether we want to obey what God said, or whether we want to obey what man says. That is what it will come down to. All this thing about mark of the beast that seems confusing is going to come down to whether we want to obey what God says versus what man says. And that is where we want to put our focus. All right. So when we come back next week, we will pick up Revelation 13, 16 to 17, as well as 18. We'll close that off. And if I have to do any sort of recapping, I will do it after we've completed these two, because I really realize that the time runs away from us when we try to just close off these and go through it in some detail. Any questions, anybody? Any comments, any concerns you have? I know we covered a lot, and I would suggest that you kind of go back again through the YouTube recording over the week and just make sure you're on top of all of this, because when we come back next week, maybe for the first time in the session, we won't do too much of a review. We will jump straight into Revelation chapter 13. Although I struggle sometimes to have a context, but I want to just make sure we try to finish this next week. Everybody all right with that? We spent a lot of time on Revelation chapter 13, but I want to tell you it's worth it. Because if we understand these principles, then when we get to 17, 16, it's going to be really tough, and it's going to be much easier if we understand what has happened here in 13. This is like a pivotal chapter, similar to what Daniel chapter 7 was when we were studying the book of Daniel. Okay, well, if there are no further questions, let's bow our heads of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you, Lord, for your blessings. We thank you for your continuing intervention in our lives, and for continuing, oh Lord, to guide us into how we are supposed to behave and live, especially in these last days. You have given us your Sabbath, dear Lord, and we now begin to appreciate this is more than just a day of worship, but a day of rejoicing, a day that helps us remember that we are owned by you. Lord, help our ego not to get into the way, but help us to be humble enough to recognize that we are owned by God. And as we are owned by God, we will live for you. Guide us and direct us according to your divine will is our prayer. In Jesus' most holy name, amen. Thank you, everyone.